Hi, and welcome back to the NCS podcast. This is Lauren Kaufman, and I'm a neurointensivist at Temple University in Philadelphia. Today, I'd like to welcome onto the podcast authors from a recent current story of hope, Tara and Ron Wall. So, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you sharing your story.
Oh, thanks for having us.
And just as a little bit of background, Tara actually shared her husband Ron's story in our current story of hope. And we're very fortunate to have you both on to kind of chat about further your experiences. So before we talk about, even being in the hospital, Ron, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what your life was like before your cardiac arrest.
Well, I've been a police officer since 1976 and played hockey twice a week for 40 some odd years. And I've never smoked, and it came out of the blue. No warning, no nothing.
Yeah, I mean, from the article, it sounded like you were a super active guy, working, physically active, very healthy. You had a lot going on. Do you remember anything from the day that the cardiac arrest occurred?
Prior to it, I had taken the dog out for a walk, and I got back, and I was sitting in the chair having a cup of coffee talking to Tara. And the next thing I know, it was 15 days later, and I was wrong. So no, warning that was going to happen.
Okay, so we'll definitely get back to hearing more about at what point you started to have some memories. And we'll have kind of Tara fill in the details from here. So I think your daughter was home because it was a holiday and you were hanging out when everything happened that day.
Yes, she was home for Veterans Day. It was November 11th, 2022. And I would have normally gotten Karis on the bus and then gone to the gym. But I decided to stay home that morning because she didn't have school. So the three of us were all sitting in the living room. Ron and I were having coffee and we were just chit-chatting. Thanksgiving was coming and we were talking about whether our son who lives in Denver might come out. And all of a sudden, I wasn't even looking at Ron and Karis said, "Oh my God, Mom, what's wrong with Dad?" And I looked over to my left and he was sitting in a chair with his coffee cup. He had his coffee cup in both hands on his lap and he was just staring forward, and he made a gasping noise. And right at about the same time, his arms almost like twisted at the wrists, and his coffee spilled all over, and he just didn't appear to have any awareness. He looked like he was looking out the window, only he had a blank look on his face. And that was when we called 911. And it's so hard to describe your feeling at the moment. It was almost like utter shock. And my first thought was actually that he might have been having some sort of a neurological event because his arms made that twisting movement. And I thought he might be doing some sort of posturing or something. And so we called 911 right away, and the 911 dispatchers for our county sheriff work with Ron. He is a part-time sheriff's deputy. And I told them, my husband, there's something wrong with my husband. He's not responding to me. I had tried to, take Ron's face and turn it toward me to see if he would respond. And I was asking him, what's the matter? Can you tell me? And there was just nothing. And so I said, there's something the matter with my husband. He's not responding. And he said, is he breathing? And I I couldn't really, it was just I think I said something like, I don't know. And I said, it's Ron Wall, you work with him. And he said, he said, well, you have to get him down on the floor. And that was that moment, I realized we were going to be starting CPR. And luckily, I'd been trained in CPR long ago, and it was just like a switch flipped because I knew how to do that. So I had to have Karis help me get Ron out of his chair because he was completely out. And I was afraid if I pulled him out of his chair by his legs, his head would hit the floor. So she had to just put her hands under his head while I pulled him down and got him laying flat. And we started, I started CPR while we waited for the EMS to arrive. And one of Ron's coworkers was the first person to get to the house, and that was about 5 or 6 minutes in, and she helped me. She did compressions and I gave breaths. And then the ambulance came and they had an AED with them. And so he got a total of, I always get it mixed up. It was either 5 shocks and 4 doses of epi or the opposite. But I think they decided it was about 31 minutes
Mhm.
that his heart rate was, he didn't have a heart rate before they could get it back. And then they put him in the ambulance and got him up to Strong.
And I know you had a former career as a neonatal intensive care nurse. Do you think that like helped in this situation? Or like it sounds like you just kind of reverted back into your prior role.
I did. It was almost like it was like I did so out of comfort. I just I didn't I didn't know what to do as a wife, as a person. I had done or assisted with CPR many times in the NICU, but it's a very different, very controlled atmosphere where you have 5 other people at the bedside with you. Everybody's got a role to play. When you're out in the wild at home and a family member or a loved one goes down is very different. And so just being able to kind of, as the team all came together and they had Ron covered in that way, I sat and watched. And, I kind of felt like I was assessing if everyone was doing a good job. Of course they were, but just falling into that role was much more comfortable to me than, being Ron's wife and not having anything to do and just falling apart. So they didn't need my help at all. They were all wonderful, but just, watching as they put the IV in and drew up the epi and, use the AED, that was just sort of something I could fall back on and feel like I was, being of some sort of help. But looking back on that day, I was just in shock. People told me that day that I was in shock, and I didn't know I was until I could look back and say, yeah, yeah, I absolutely was.
I mean, even if you were in shock, it sounds like you did everything, as perfectly as possible to get the best care delivered as quickly as possible. And to kind of get people caught up if they haven't read the article, Ron got admitted after being resuscitated, and it sounds like they did for people that aren't aware, after a cardiac arrest or after someone's heart stops, they oftentimes get cooled to protect the brain for a period of time. And, they start to do a workup and lots of tests to see if, can sort out what caused this. And it sounds like you were diagnosed with a cardiomyopathy, and meaning the heart wasn't pumping normally, and it was kind of unclear at that point what had caused it. So I know that must have been so much information coming at you within the first few days, on top of him, essentially being comatose. Like what was going through your mind at that time?
I took it hour by hour. We had a lot of family who was at the hospital. A lot of Ron's friends and coworkers were, showing up to visit and see what was going on. So I always had a lot a lot of talking to do. Everybody who came in, they would want an update. And so it was a busy time, people coming and going, being present for rounds. and that sort of thing. But it was chaotic, and I just, like I said, took it hour by hour. I didn't really think about the possibility that he might not make it at that point. I was just so into, learning about the cooling process and talking to members of his medical team and getting information about what kind of blood work they were drawing and what kind of tests he would need while he was there. And I don't know, I just wouldn't let myself really have a moment to ponder how bad the outcome of that could have been.
And then it sounds like, after several days, a lot of tests get done. There's kind of this waiting period. We wait and watch, right? Watch and see if anything happens, if things get better. And when things didn't get better, the neurology team was kind of following along. And it sounds like they were chatting with you about what the EEG findings were and the MRI. And it overall didn't seem very positive. Is that the right way to kind of put it?
That's correct. Yeah. No, it didn't seem positive at all. And they brought palliative neurology in, and about maybe it was a week in, Ron just didn't seem to be waking up or responding to stimuli in the way that they had hoped. He had quite a bit of myoclonus present, and his MRI, showed some areas of anoxia and hypoxia. And I always remember his EEG was described to me as being angry looking, and they had him on a couple different anti-seizure medications at the time. And they told me about a weekend that we needed to start having some conversations at home about comfort care versus continuing to do everything they could. And if we opted to do everything they could to continue with that, it was about 90%, I think they told me, likely that he would wind up in a nursing home. They said if I decided that they were going to give it another week, they told me that 2 weeks was about the cutoff for having to really make some hard choices. And so we had another week, and they said that if I opted to go all out at that point, they would put in a tracheostomy tube and a feeding tube, a G tube, and transfer to a nursing home at that point. If nothing happened, from where we were at that point. So, and they asked if we'd like to have a family meeting. Ron has a very big family who are very involved. And we decided to have a family meeting with all the members of his team. So at that point, I think there were probably about 20 of us in the conference room, and they had representatives from the ICU and neuro and palliative. There were 3 or 4 doctors there who all sort of weighed in, and the general consensus from the neurologist who was on service at the time was that I remember her saying, we just don't know. I've looked at his MRI and I just can't really give you anything concrete to go on at this point in terms of what you're looking at. She said, I think what you need to do is decide what kind of a life would be meaningful for Ron. If he's able to go home at some point, would he be happy just, sitting on the couch watching movies? Would that not be meaningful for him? And that was a very difficult question to answer because, as Ron said in the beginning, he was a very active person. He just, I really had no idea whether being sedentary and not being able to do the things he was used to doing would be meaningful for him. It was a tough decision. And so at the end of the meeting, and like I said, we were about a week out at this point. I said, let's give him, the next week and see where we're at. And then when it's time to decide, then we'll make the decision. And everybody seemed to be in agreement with that. So that was what came of the family meeting. And it was right after that that he woke up. He just
Mhm.
woke up. Um,
He saved you from having to make any decisions.
he surely did. Yes, I'm very grateful to him for that.
About the cars.
Oh yeah, yeah. I didn't mention. I know you asked Ron early in the conversation about, our life before his cardiac arrest, and he and I have been together for a long time, and we've always loved this music group, the Cars. And we would play their music at home all the time. We would watch videos on TV. We just really liked their music. And the evening, we had the family meeting about 3 in the afternoon. And I had gone down afterwards to the cafeteria for dinner. And I was standing next to the salad bar, and I heard this song by this group, the Cars, come on, like whatever they have, the overhead, the music that they play in the cafeteria. And I worked in this hospital for 17 years. I'd been in that cafeteria so many times. I can't even tell you. And I'd never heard that song playing overhead before. And I just stopped what I was doing for a few seconds and listened, and it was definitely that song. And that was a wonderful moment. I felt like he was sending me a message. He hadn't officially woken up yet, much less talked to me at all or given me any indication that he knew I was there. But when I heard that song play, I was just so over the moon. I thought it was a good sign. And it was not long after that. He woke up.
The name of the song is just what I needed.
Yeah, that was the name of the song. So yeah, that was a crazy moment for sure.
And, during that whole like time period, we were waiting and, trying to figure out what's going on. On our side as like the providers, we have these conversations and we try and give as much information as possible, but it's hard to know like what we can do to help support family members. Is there anything that you found really helpful that the team did for you or communicated with you that even made you feel a little bit better or, helped in some way?
I felt like for the most part, the team was very supportive. And like you said, it's a very tough position to be in, I think, as a provider, because you want to support the family. You also want to give them an accurate idea of what they're looking at for their loved one's future. I think they walked a fine line, but I really appreciated there was one nurse that I just loved. Her name was Taryn, and one of the days that one of the neuro docs came in to, share the MRI results with me and show me the areas that didn't look so good and how he felt. He was very clinical about it, very forthright, and said, you're looking at a 90% chance of nursing home placement here. And after he left, I think I burst into tears and I said to Taryn, I just want to give him a chance. I know that, he's an active person. I don't think he would welcome life in a nursing home, but I just want to give him a chance. And comfort care seemed like such a drastic choice to make. And she was so supportive and she said, you have to give him a chance. It was nice that so many people were so supportive. I think it wouldn't have mattered necessarily what route I decided to take with it. They would have just supported me, and that's a wonderful thing. I loved that, and I appreciated the doctor who had to give me that information, and I know that that information it was necessary for me to have. But I'm telling you, it's difficult. It's very difficult to make that choice to begin with. Um, and we've talked about this a lot since the idea that how much How many times do families feel like they're being guided to make the choice to go with comfort care? And then you never know what the outcome necessarily would have been. But on the other hand, you know, how many times do families make the choice to go all out on their loved one's care and wind up with a family member who's, almost trapped in a nursing home setting with a trach and a G tube because it's a very difficult position to be in. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, to be honest with you. But I felt like for the most part, the entire staff was wonderful to us. And, the palliative neurology team was just so caring and gentle and just was always there for us. It was, for the most part, a wonderful experience.
So it sounds like time, support, and information is, and luck in your case
Yeah.
is what was needed. Ron, at what point do you remember anything in this whole kind of period of time?
Well, right after the event, you want to hear what I saw?
Sure, I'd love to hear that if you're comfortable sharing.
I'll share it with everybody. So I saw a white, bright light. It was almost like a sunrise in the morning with not a lot of different colors. And I felt the light was very warm and it bathed me and made me feel very comfortable. It was serene. And and then and then I was being drawn toward this light, and it was the most pleasant feeling I've ever experienced. And then I heard Tara say, no, no, no.
Killjoy.
And that's all, that's really the only memory I got that I can connect to the event. The next thing
I don't
I,
think I've ever heard any story like that. Like, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. Do you, I think it's a day 11 is when they were able to safely take the breathing tube out and extubate you. And then you kind of progressed along from the ICU to the floor. Do you remember, starting to work with physical therapy at that point, or is that still kind of a blur too?
it's fragmented. My recollection isn't a continuous thing. I remember bits and parts of it. I don't know why. But yeah, I remember the rehab stuff. I didn't have a clock in my room, so I'd wake up and I'd have no idea whether it was nighttime or daytime because I didn't have a window. And Carol,
Yeah, his nurse, Carol.
she brought me a clock.
Yeah, she was a sweetheart.
So there was a lot of things going on that I just wanted to get through. I wanted to get better. I knew I put Tara through a lot, so I was trying not to be too much of a burden for her. Except I called her like 4 o'clock in the morning every
And
time
he
because it didn't make a difference to
didn't know
me.
what time it was.
But no, everybody, I was very happy about the care I received, and everybody was very gentle in their approach to me. And I wish I could remember things in a more proper context, but it's just kind of all there. And I
Mhm.
have to, by other events, when something occurred, like I don't even know when I heard her say no, at what part. I assume it was during the
Yeah,
CPR.
it was during the CPR. Yeah.
So, but other than that, no, nothing.
I mean,
Yeah,
honestly, you
there's
might
a
not
guy.
even want to remember some of the memories from being in the hospital or, being really frustrated. I think you went to acute rehab and you mentioned like 6 hours a day of, a very intensive like therapies. What was the most challenging thing for you to do while you're kind of in rehab?
Numbers, and I couldn't spell, and I couldn't even dial a phone number because I'd do the one number and then I wouldn't remember what number I'd already punched in to do the second number. And that was frustrating because I knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't seem to get from where it had to be to where I had to do it, you know. So that was very frustrating and I was tired all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
I was wiped out.
Yeah, which is a huge adjustment for you, someone who's, super active, running, working, had a business. What was something that was really motivating to you? It sounds like you had a huge support system of people in the community and your family. He's pointing to Tara.
Yeah, she was my rock.
And so, Tara, how did you kind of handle taking on the position of the caretaker? I know in the article you mentioned when Ron eventually came home, there's a list of medications, there's all these appointments, and there's a lot to manage.
Yeah, yeah. I really, more than anything else, just didn't want to drop the ball. He was on about 20 medications when he came home. Some of them were 3 times a day, some twice a day. And we had OT, PT, and speech coming in each twice a week at first. And he had lots of follow-up appointments, rehabilitation, obviously cardiology, neurology. It was just lots of coming and going. And I just, because I'm a nurse, I really just did not want to drop the ball. It felt like all the time that he had been in the hospital for 56 days, I was relying on everybody else to care for him and get him where he needed to be. And now it was on me. It was my turn. And so that was a little stressful. And I'll say too that Ron, in some ways, he was a perfect patient because he was extremely motivated to get back 100%. But that also,
Too motivated. I
and
was too motivated.
also, yes, um, did not always work in his favor because he would do things that were sometimes not safe because he felt like he had to push himself
I
to
fell.
get
I
better.
fell a lot.
He fell, he did stairs way before he should have. And, in general, he was very, very weak when he got home. He had a walker, but he really couldn't go more than 6 steps the day he got home. And even into he got home in the month of January, even into the spring, he couldn't make it down the length of our whole driveway. He really had to work hard to get all of his strength back. And, he did it. He
Yeah.
uh he worked his tail off.
My weight went from 185 to 150.
Yeah, when he came home, his weight was 150. He had lost all that weight in those 56 days in the hospital.
And I wasn't fat.
Right.
It sounds like you were, putting the time in, maybe even doing too much independent rehab at home, and but it paid off because I think about a year after the cardiac arrest, you're back to work. Am I right on that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you think you were back to like your self normally, or there's still some things you kind of have challenges?
I got a little quirk. I got a couple little quirks. Spelling, sometimes I can't spell a simple word. Numbers, I think I'm better than I was before. I remember everything now. But there's some little bumps in the road that I don't know whether they're ever going to go away. But yeah, it's not nothing big.
I mean, it sounds like if there are a few of those things, you're able to, still live your life essentially to the point that you were before all this.
Yeah, they
Right.
said that I had some dead spots in my brain and that my brain would figure out a way to get around them. And I think it just took a while for that to happen.
Yeah, that was fascinating. They told us that the brain makes new pathways, and that seems to be what happened. It's fascinating, really.
I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story. Do you have any advice for anyone that might be going through a similar situation?
Just everybody's different. I guess I don't even know if I do have any advice, to be honest with you. It's just you just kind of fly by the seat of your pants when you're in a situation like that. You're blindsided, you don't see it coming, and um, yeah, I can't even think of any advice I would offer people, but I'd like to be able to say, take some time for yourself when you can, but even that, it's just
Sounds like patience might be, one thing you walked away, you were patient in the hospital, patient with the whole rehab process. And after some time went by, you guys were kind of get back to living your lives.
Yeah, we had a wonderful team of caregivers for Ron, which, made it as wonderful as it could be. I always trusted that he was in good hands when he was on the rehab unit and when he was in the ICU. And that was super, super helpful. It was a wonderful thing to have those people.
Ron, do you have any final words you want to share with our listeners or advice for anyone that might be recovering from a cardiac arrest?
Other than marry a nurse. No, basically
Yeah.
all I did is lay there. But you want to hear another interesting story, though. That deputy that showed up, she's a Bills super fan.
A
Hmm.
Buffalo.
Hmm.
So they're actually doing a Netflix documentary or series next August, and she was kind of included in it. And when they found out her connection to me, because the caption for the series is "One Before I Die."
Just one before I die.
It was when the Bills were in the Super Bowl back in the 90s. They went four times and didn't win. And this one fan had a t-shirt or a sweatshirt made up, just one before I die. So they're doing this Netflix series. A film crew from Hollywood came out and spent the whole afternoon here filming us. And then Becky came down, the deputy, and she was
Yeah.
included.
Yeah.
So,
They wanted to hear the story of how Becky came to the house and, she was amazing. She got here so quickly.
so got me a lot of notoriety,
Yeah.
for the
Well,
for the
I'll have
wrong
to
reason.
keep an eye out on Netflix for that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I
So,
really appreciate it. We'll make sure we include a link in the article in the show notes to check out this or other Currents content. Head to currents.neurocriticalcare.org. As a reminder, NCS offers free CME for select podcasts. You can listen via the NCS Learning Center and complete a short survey to receive your credits. And don't forget to add us to your favorites.